Let me ask you something more on the historical side. When you think about Netanyahu's relationship with Smotrich and Ben Gvir, for instance, you probably know that Netanyahu's father was one of the number two man to Jabotinsky, and Jabotinsky was recognized even by Israel's founders as basically a Hitler figure. So
I wouldn't put it that way, but I would say a kind of terrorist figure and an extreme hardliner.
hmm. So
But I think the point is right that this is a very hardline faction that has never uh, been able to see uh, the real human side of what's happening in this very small part of the world where uh, there are millions of people who do not want to be ruled by a Jewish state because they're Palestinian Arabs. It's
mhm,
simple.
right. So on another subject, I just had a interview with Dr. Mahathir bin Mohammed, somebody whom I've interviewed in the past, and
Wow.
my late wife Gail also did an interview with him way back in 1999.
Wow.
This is an extraordinary interview. He's 99 years old now,
I know.
but in excellent shape, sharp as a tack. And uh, he said that one of the fundamental causes of the current danger of noble war is the failure of the United Nations, due primarily to the veto power waged over and over by the United States, essentially, to prevent any effort to rein in Israel's genocide. His quote was, "I think this confrontation between East and West should stop. We should not divide the world into two, and we should have a workable United Nations that has no veto power." That's the quote. He said it needs to be dramatically reformed or a brand new institution must be created. And I know you've been involved in efforts to reform the UN for a long, long time. In particular, I saw recently that you were a participant at something called the Summit for the Future
Yeah.
just a couple of weeks ago at the UN, whose purpose was to address the question of the reform of the UN, among other things. So is there any progress in that event? Do you see a way forward on any of this?
You know, it's easy to be cynical about the UN because it doesn't stop wars, and that's what its main purpose is. And it hasn't solved the Ukraine war. It hasn't solved the uh, Israel-Palestine crisis, and many other wars as well. And people say it's a talk shop, and it doesn't function. And there's truth to that. But I take a somewhat different view, which is that uh, we've had wars throughout human history, and it's only 1 century that we've tried to have an international institution that would prevent or stop wars. And the first attempt at that was the League of Nations, which was established after World War I. And it closed its shop after World War II because it had failed. And then the UN is the second attempt, and the UN will be 80 years old next year. It was established in 1945. And it's not working very well. And I spend most of my time and most of my professional life trying to help the UN because I believe in it, and I think it's still a kid. From the point of view of human history, we're just 80 years into this venture of trying to make an international system, a global system, really work. And why doesn't it work? Well, the main problem is the great powers. There are only a few major powers in the world. On the surface, the UN is supposed to be a group of equal sovereign countries, and in a way, that's true in the UN General Assembly, with 193 states, each with one vote. But in fact, as you point out, in the UN Security Council, which is the place where war and peace issues are acted upon, deliberated and acted upon, 5 countries, the US, China, Russia, France, and Britain, for historical reasons at the end of World War II, as the UN was being created, took it upon themselves in this new creation in the Charter to give themselves the power of veto. And they actually not only gave themselves the power of the veto in the UN Security Council, but even a veto over changes of the UN Charter itself. And so this is a kind of catch-22. How do you reform the UN against the abuses of great powers if the great powers, each one by itself, can veto any change in the Charter? And we're a little bit stuck, in truth, on this right now. Now, my argument would be the veto system, where each of these so-called P5 members or permanent 5 members can stop the functioning of the UN by an individual veto, as the US has done in the case of Israel and Palestine just recently, in fact, on a number of occasions. That's not serving the real interests of the US or the real interests of any of the major powers, because the wars are becoming extremely dangerous. We're moving closer and closer to nuclear war, actually, because this is a great power confrontation, and it's escalating before our eyes. It's very frightening. And so I'm trying to argue through reason and through evidence and through logic that it's in the interests of even the great powers to make this system work before we all blow ourselves up, or they blow us all up, to put it a little bit more accurately, because we're not even asked our opinions about this. If we were asked, we'd say, don't blow us up, stay away from nuclear war. But we need a pretty deep change. And if it's going to work, inventing a new structure isn't going to solve this problem. If the US says, well, I'm not part of it, or I'm not going to abide by the rules, or and so forth. Inventing a new one doesn't solve any of the problems that we face right now. What we need is a change of mindset. We need a different approach. We need a different idea. We need the idea of collective security. We need the idea that we are trapped in this together. We're all on this planet. We are all extremely vulnerable to this escalation of war, and we need to reason our way through this before we get blown up. And this, I think, is the main point of all of this. So far, the U.S. isn't buying it. So far, the U.S. approach, and this is a deep issue, because if we step aside from the immediate issues of Israel and Palestine, there's a deeper problem, which is that the U.S. has been trying to run the world for decades, including how it acts in the Middle East. But it's what has gotten us into the Ukraine war. It's what's gotten us into countless wars in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine, and many others that I could list. And these are wars of choice that the U.S. security state has made, because the U.S. security state, really starting in 1945, by the way, but especially in hyperdrive, starting in 1991, said, we run the world and no one can tell us what to do. And of course, this is it's absurd on one level, but it's tragic at another level. It's completely delusional. The US is 4.1% of the world population. How could we run the world? We're one country out of 193. How could we run the world? But this has been the US attitude. And the U.S. deep state, the U.S. security state views the UN, okay, sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes it's a nuisance because it's trying to tell us what to do. And so the U.S. views the UN with a lot of disdain, actually, much of the time. Don't tell us. And we don't even need to ratify treaties that all the rest of the world has signed on and so forth. This is very dangerous, this way of thinking. And it's increasingly out of touch with reality, because also what the United States deep state or security state has not noticed is that China's caught up and other countries are catching up, and the US is not so dominant in any sphere, in technology and economy and military power, that it can make this extraordinary claim that it's the sole superpower and it can do what it wants. So my point is, we need to think this through better and then understand this has to change. And there are many proposals, for example, that these 5 countries could have a veto, but it could be overridden. There are 15 countries on the Security Council, 5 permanent, 10 rotating. You could imagine that if there's a veto by one of the P5, that say 11 or 12 of the Security Council could override the veto. Say, yes, you vetoed it, but just like a presidential veto in the US Constitution can be overridden by a supermajority of the House and the Senate, well, the same thing could be true in the Security Council. It would be completely reasonable. What happened, for example, when the vote came up to give Palestine statehood, which would be a crucial step to ending this war. Of course, Israel objected. It's not on the Security Council, so it had no say in this, actually, by international law. But the US on the Security Council said, we will veto this on behalf of Israel. It's, by the way, a pathetic example of US foreign policy, because we say we're in favor of a state of Palestine, but then when it comes for a vote, we say, Israel, what do you want? Oh, you want us to vote it down? Okay, we'll vote it down. And we vetoed it. And there was no override. There were 12 votes in favor of Palestinian statehood. There was 1 vote against, the United States. And there were 2 abstentions because US allies didn't want to cross the United States, but they didn't want to vote against Palestine either. And so, what a mess. We stopped peace. There could be peace in the Middle East, but we stopped it. And that's the sense in which the UN isn't working right now. But we just had this meeting where the vast majority of humanity is not the United States. The vast majority of humanity does not want the US to lead. It wants the world to operate according to the UN Charter and international law, and without one country being able to veto the will of the world. And so there's a call for reform. But there is the catch-22 that the US can keep saying no. And I think as an American, I'm trying to say to other Americans, this is not in our interest. This idea of go it alone is not making us safer. It's making us a lot less safe. And I'm trying to say to the US government, all your foreign policy over all these decades, it's not working. The United States is distrusted all over the world. The United States is regarded as a danger all over the world right now. What a terrible situation to be in. And so-called, gains from all this power, where are they? We've spent maybe $7 trillion on these wasted, useless wars that have brought no results, that have raised the US public debt from 1/3 of our national income to 100% of our national income in just 25 years. We're less secure now than we were in the past. We have competitors that can fight us on the battlefield and fight us to their advantage. And so the whole idea of US foreign policy needs to be rethought. And we should be looking to the Security Council for collective security, actually. But we're not right now. Now, the Biden administration's been awful, in my view. It's been one of the worst governments in terms of U.S. foreign policy. That's saying a lot, by the way, because they've all been bad for decades. And this idea of U.S. dominance and being the sole superpower has been pretty consistent through Clinton, through Bush Jr., through Obama, through Trump, through Biden. You know, this has been a deep state foreign policy, not something that's Democrats versus Republicans. We need a complete change of viewpoint because what we're doing right now just is not working.
Dr. Mahathir pointed to the idea of non-alignment as the equivalent of saying we can't have this East versus West.
It's a fascinating point, by the way, if I could just interject one point. All Ukraine needed to do and should have done to stay safe is to say we're neutral.
Yeah.
Because Russia never
March 22 deal.
Exactly. And what happened was they had a government that wanted neutrality in 2014. Viktor Yanukovych as president, and the U.S. helped to overthrow him precisely because the U.S. deep state can't stand neutrality. They say, oh, if you're neutral, you're against us. But neutrality just really means leave us alone. It doesn't mean we're against anybody. It means we want to have decent relations on all sides. And if Ukraine today, just today, would say, we're neutral, we don't want NATO, Russia would stop the war.
I think you're right. The other thing that Mahathir said was, and I brought it up, but he responded, he said, that's really what the BRICS, the UN has failed to create a non-aligned situation. And that's what the BRICS is trying to do, that it's attempting to create some sort of a non-alignment process in the world. Do you think so?
Essentially, what's happening is that the U.S. has its allies, and those allies, by and large, remain pretty closely tied to the U.S. So who are they? It's the U.S., it's Canada, it's Great Britain, it's the European Union, it's Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. That's pretty much what the U.S. calls its friends and allies. Now, there are also places not on that list where the U.S. has military bases, and that tends to scare the wits out of the host country. Those bases got there for some historical reason, but now those bases are where the U.S. military and often the CIA operate, and the host government's often afraid, you know, if we cross the U.S., they're going to overthrow our government. And that's a pretty frequent occurrence. So the U.S. has its allies. If you add up the population of the U.S. and its allies, Europe has about 450 million people in it. The U.S. about 340 million people. So that's about 790 million people. Britain, another 60. So that's 850. Japan, roughly 100 million, 950. Korea, 50 million, a billion. Rounding it up, the U.S. and its allies are maybe around 1.2 billion people. The world has 8 billion people in it right now. So it's a little more than an eighth of the world population. China, India, together are 2.8 billion people. So you're already talking about 2.8, nearly 40% of the world population. Just the two, and they're in the BRICS. You add in Russia, you add in the other countries that have newly joined. So it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa were the original five. And now there's Egypt and Ethiopia and Iran and the Emirates makes nine. Saudi Arabia is kind of on the fence. I'm not sure whether they're in or out. And then there's a long, long list of wannabes. Turkey has applied to become a part of the BRICS, which is really interesting because Turkey's a NATO country. But Turkey's been rebuffed so long, treated so badly by Europe. They say, okay, we'll join the BRICS. So there's a long waiting list. My view is what the BRICS are basically representing is what you said. It's the world that is not the US and its military allies. So that's most of the world. And the US keeps saying we lead the world, but you look at who's following the US in this parade. Maybe it's an eighth of the world population. And it's a terrible miscalculation. The US thought, okay, we'll put sanctions on Russia and we'll crush the Russian economy. What happened? Well, most of the world said, no, thank you. We'll continue to trade with Russia. This isn't our war. This is your war. We're not interested. So this idea that the US leads the world is really out of date. It was never right. It was always delusional, but it's way out of date right now.
Yeah.
And what the BRICS represent by themselves, by the way, just by the 9 or the 10, depending on whether Saudi Arabia is in or out, is about 46% of the world population. It's about 36% of the world GDP compared to, say, the G7 countries, the US, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Britain, and Japan, which is 29% of the world GDP. So the BRICS is a major group. It's nearly half of the world population. There's a long waiting list to get in right now of other countries. It's basically the countries that are not the US military allies. And I have to say, even the members of NATO are looking around right now saying, are we really, really in this for American hegemony? Are we really in this for American dominance? Is this why we want to have these wars? And this is why we have the Ukraine war. The United States wants to have military bases on Russia's border. Russia said no. It eventually turned into a war, not surprisingly. And so far, the other NATO countries, by and large, have said, yes, the U.S. is right, Russia's wrong. But in fact, behind the scenes, they're saying, this is
Hungary
this is
today,
ugly. This is ugly.
Even before the scenes, just said we will never allow Ukraine to be part of NATO.
Yes,
absolutely
Hungary and Slovakia and the president of Croatia and the winners of all the recent elections across Europe, by the way, are parties so-called right or so-called left. It's not even clear what these labels mean anymore, but against the war and anti-NATO because they don't want to fight world wars for U.S. hegemony, just like the U.S. should not be fighting wars for Israel's ownership of occupied lands. These wars make no sense.
Speaking of Russia, I was quite struck by your description when you did this interview with Tucker Carlson of this really incredible moment in sitting in the Kremlin across from Boris Yeltsin when he came in and announced the end of the Soviet Union. But most interesting was that you said he then asked you what's the U.S. response going to be, and that you totally believed at that moment that, in fact, the U.S. would say, great, we'll help any way we can for you to become a normal country, which is the term that Yeltsin was using for what he aspired to be. And of course, you didn't
Wrong.
get that response. What happened when you came to the U.S. with that proposal?
So the story in brief was that I became, through lots of quirks, twists, and turns, advisor to Poland in 1989 as Poland was making the transition from the Soviet style system to a democracy and a market economy. And I worked with both the government, which was the last of the communist governments, and then with the new post-communist government after elections took place on June 4th, 1989. And I was in a very central role. I was kind of a kid, but I had ideas that were helpful for them. And one of the ideas, for example, was cancel a lot of Poland's debts, which had occurred during the Cold War period, so that Poland could have a fresh start. And I had another idea of helping them to stabilize their currency to avoid a high inflation and I had the idea of creating a special fund to stabilize the Polish currency. And when I presented that to the US government in 1989, it was accepted within 8 hours, actually. I said, Poland needs $1 billion. And I presented the case to the National Security Advisor, General Scowcroft, in one morning in September 1989. And by the end of the day, the White House said, okay, tell your friends they have $1 billion stabilization fund. So, and then Poland stabilized and it became integrated quickly within the Western European economies. It was a difficult period for sure. This was a tumultuous era, but Poland began economic growth and stability, and it got Western financial help, and it got a large part of its debt canceled. Well, Gorbachev's economic advisor was watching, going to Poland. What's going on here? And then he contacted me, said, we'd like to do the same thing. And what do you think about Western help for this? I said, of course there'll be Western help. Gorbachev's a man of peace. He's talking about a common European home. This is a dream that the U.S. has hoped for decades. Of course there will be help for Gorbachev. And so I worked with a small team at MIT and Harvard in the spring of 1992 to make a proposal for help for the 1991, excuse me, to make a plan for help for Gorbachev's reforms. And the leader of that, who was the one who was closest to the White House, to George W. Bush Sr., took the plan, which was a very good, sensible plan, to the White House in the spring of 1991, and it was flatly rejected. No way we're going to help the Soviet Union. So complete dismissal. And Gorbachev went back from the G7 summit in 1991 empty-handed, and he was abducted in a putsch attempt. And that was basically the end of his power, and within a few months, the end of the Soviet Union itself. Now, then, that was in August. In September, Yeltsin, who was now the ascendant politician of Russia, not the Soviet Union, his economic advisor called me and said, okay, Jeff, come to Moscow, help us. And I said, okay. So I went to Moscow, and Boris Yeltsin was already president of Russia, but there was still the Soviet Union. And he said, we want to be normal. We just want to be cooperative. We want to end this communist system. We want to just be a normal country, normal foreign policy, and so on. I said, great, this is unbelievable. We're living through the dream world of history. It's not the Soviet Union even. Who could object? So it happened that in December, mid-December 1991, we had a meeting in the Kremlin, and I was the head of the delegation, a small delegation of Western economists, and Yeltsin and his economic team were to meet with us. And so we sat in a room in the Kremlin. And this already, this was the Cold War. This was 45 years. This was the mortal enemy. And here I am. I just have to say, it was 1991. So I was 37 years old. And there I am, and Yeltsin comes across this giant room in the Kremlin, and he sits down face to face, and literally he says, with a big smile on his face, "Gentlemen," because we were all men, actually, "Gentlemen, I want to tell you the Soviet Union is over." And to hear this with your own ears in the Kremlin, and this was through a translator, of course, just to be clear, and he pointed to the door way in the back where he had just come out of. He said, "Do you know who is in that room?" And of course, we didn't know. And he said, "The leaders of the Soviet military. And they have just agreed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union." And so I heard it with my own ears, that moment, real time. And then we had a 1 hour or so meeting, and Yeltsin was pitch perfect. He said, "We want peace. We want to end this whole era. We want to be a normal economy. We want normal relations with everybody. We want peace with the United States." Then they turned to me. I was head of the delegation. And I'm floating at this point because this is the end of the Cold War, and you're sitting there watching this in real time. And I said, "Mr. President, this is the most wonderful news. This is the chance for peace in our era. We will help you. We're here to help you, Mr. President. And I am determined to go home back to my country, to the United States, to relay your message and your words that Russia wants peace. Russia wants a normal relationship. Russia needs financial help because this is a real crisis right now economically." And I assured him, I said, "I can't imagine this. Of course, this is the dream we've been waiting for generations. The chance for peace, the chance to end the Cold War." I really believed it. And I flew home, and I went straight to Washington and straight to the IMF, actually, because they were the coordinating group. And the deputy managing director told me, someone I knew, "No, it's not going to happen." "What do you mean?" "No." And he stood there kind of with just a cold face. He was a messenger explaining, "No, it's not going to happen." And I'm pretty stubborn, pretty optimistic. You could say naive at that moment. But I thought, you just don't understand. The Cold War just ended. All that we've been working towards for decades, it's over. Make peace. Give a little help. And I was sure that it would happen. And I persisted in January 1992, February 1992. I think it was March 1992. I'm not absolutely sure, but somebody recently just sent me the tape when I appeared on, I think then it was called the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, but I appeared on national television together with the acting Secretary of State at the time, Lawrence Eagleburger. And we were on together, and I made the case, of course we have to help these people. Are you kidding? This is the greatest moment of world peace possible. And Eagleburger was saying, no, we're not going to do that, and so forth. We have to be very careful, and I don't remember exactly his arguments, but I found it incredibly frustrating. And at the end of the show, the lights went off, the cameras went off, and he said to me very nicely, "Jeff, can I give you a lift back to the district?" We were in, I think, Alexandria, Virginia, the PBS studio. And I said, "Yes, Mr. Secretary." And we got in his car, and he said to me, "I want to explain something to you, Jeff. You know all the arguments you gave? It's interesting, but the Polish finance minister was here last week And he said the same thing you're saying. And so I want to tell you, even if I agree with what you're saying, I do want you to know it's not going to happen. And I was a little perplexed because he just said, even if I agree with you. And I said, I don't understand why. He said, do you know what year this is? I said, yes, I do. It's 1992. He said, do you know what that means, Jeff? I said, well, do you mean that it's a presidential election? I said, yes. He said, yes. And he said, it's not going to happen. Okay. Well, I thought anyway that it would happen because it was necessary to happen, that we would help, that we would stabilize, that we would have normal relations. But there were two senses in which it wasn't going to happen. One was the short-term political sense. The other was a much more serious one that I didn't really appreciate at the time, even for years afterwards. That was the very moment that Wolfowitz and Cheney and others were plotting what they decided would be U.S. hegemony. They didn't want to help Russia. Russia was still an enemy. Russia was a big state. Russia was a challenger. Russia was a threat in their view. So what they wanted was U.S. power, U.S. dominance. And this is, of course, what they put into action, what we call the neoconservatives. And they were there already in 1992 in the White House. And by the time Clinton came in, I had high hopes. Okay, maybe it'll change with Clinton. So I tried one more time. But just before Clinton took office, the person who had been advising Clinton on Russian affairs wrote to me or called me and said, Jeff, I'm quitting. I'm not going to join the administration because they're not interested either in helping. I said, no, it can't be. And, in retrospect, it's amazing. I went in, I met the new team under Clinton. I explained how urgent it was to give financial help and to have normal relations. And this was Strobe Talbot, who was the lead Russia advisor of Clinton, Clinton's roommate during his time at Oxford. And the deputy was Victoria Nuland, who became one of the lead neoconservatives for the next 20 years. Clinton was the same attitude. We're not going to help. We're going to expand NATO. So what turned out, Mike, over the next 30 years was that the U.S. had no intention of having normal relations with Russia. The U.S. wanted dominance. It wanted dominance through NATO expansion. It wanted dominance by leaving various nuclear arms control agreements like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement or the Open Skies Agreement. The U.S. said, we're doing it our way. We don't need these treaties. We don't need you. We don't care about your objections to NATO enlargement. We don't respect you, basically. This is our show. We'll take out Saddam Hussein. We'll take out Bashar al-Assad. We'll take out the government in Afghanistan. We'll overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. We'll overthrow Yanukovych. This is the U.S. show, thank you very much. This is not the UN Charter. This is not mutual respect. This is not collective security. This is a US-led world, what we call the rules-based order, which means we rule. That's the order. So, you're on mute, Mike.
You're right. I was sneezing, so I went on mute. One of the main weapons they used in this process was the weaponization of the dollar, with these massive sanctions all over the world, and secondary sanctions, and you name it. In addition to the regime change wars, when that didn't work well enough. But as I'm sure you know, the BRICS meeting, which is coming up in just 2 weeks, I think, it is formulating new policies in this process on how to deal with the collapsing Western economies and how to run a more sane system. Putin, on October 4th, at a meeting, interestingly, of the Russian Security Council, not the economics team, but at the Security Council, used these words, quote, "I suggest that we discuss measures for establishing an international payment system, one of the biggest challenges we face." And again, this was a meeting on security, which certainly demonstrates that he knows that the war policy is driven by the collapsing Western financial system, and that new systems are urgently necessary. So, as you've just described, you've been deeply involved with Russia. I think you've had similar relations with China and other nations on ideas for new systems. What do you expect from the BRICS meeting, and what do you recommend?
Well, basically, like you say, the U.S. weaponized the dollar. And what that means is that most payments for international trade are actually denominated in dollars. They're made in banks that hold dollar reserves, and they use a clearing system called SWIFT, which is based in Belgium. And the U.S. Dominates that system, of course, because it's the US dollar. The Fed is the ultimate issuer of the dollar. And geopolitically, the US controls the SWIFT system. So what the US has been doing now for a couple of decades with countries that it doesn't like, it's a growing list because those countries don't like what the US is doing, but countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, Venezuela, and others that the U.S. Aims at is putting on financial sanctions that in various ways prevent not only U.S. trade with those countries, but any country trading with those countries that the U.S. targets through this dollar-based trading system. So if a country wants to, let's say a Chinese company wants to import something from Russia, you'd say, fine, they don't care about US sanctions, but it's not so simple because when the Chinese company wants to make a payment, it would usually make a payment through its bank, which would then have a corresponding relationship, say, with a Russian bank, and the payment would be made. But the Chinese bank typically is a major bank in international commerce, and it would also use dollars, even if the particular purchase of the Russian good was denominated in rubles or in renminbi. The Chinese bank would also be engaged in dollar-based trade because that's how most trade is. And then the US would say, you're dealing with Russia. And the bank would say, yes, but not about you. No, it doesn't matter. You're violating our sanctions. So we're going to cut you off not only for the Russia business, but for anything you're doing in the international system. These are the secondary sanctions that you're talking about. So what happens is that even if countries don't agree with the US sanctions, even if they want to stay out of this, they cannot trade with Russia right now because the banks that they would use to make payments are vulnerable to the US sanctions. And I was recently in Mongolia, which is a country that lies between Russia and China. And naturally, a lot of the economy trades with Russia. But they cannot trade right now on a normal basis. Not because they don't want to, of course they want to, they even need to. Not because there aren't things to sell and things to buy, but because the banks are afraid to have transactions with Russian counterparts because the US will sanction the banks not on those transactions, but on Mongolia's transactions with Europe, with the United States, with any place that uses the SWIFT account, which is most of the world trade. So what should Russia do? What should countries do that don't want to be vulnerable to US sanctions, which, by the way, are illegal under international law, because you're not allowed to do this. The US is not allowed under international law to tell Mongolia, you can't trade with Russia. You can have sanctions, but they have to be voted by the UN Security Council. Those are the only legal sanctions. Every year, the UN General Assembly votes to say, no country can unilaterally tell other countries how to have their third-party trade. That's illegal. But the US does it anyway because it doesn't care about international law. It cares about US power. And so if countries want to have trade and not be subjected to this illegal system that the US foists on these countries that it doesn't like, it has to have non-dollar payments. And that sounds easy, and it is easy in one sense. So don't trade in dollars, trade in rubles, trade in renminbi, trade in rupees. But the problem is you need also banks or institutions that are not also doing normal dollar business, which is most of the world's banks, because they become vulnerable to the US if they're going around US illegal sanctions with some non-dollar part of their business. So the long and the short of it, Mike, is that there needs to be a set of banks or other related institutions that just have no dollar business. They can be special vehicles that are established just to say, no, we don't like your sanctions. They're not legal. And you can't touch this institution because it has nothing to do with your SWIFT system. So how are you going to punish it? I think that this is the direction that they're heading, because they actually don't want one country, or even one country and its NATO allies, deciding how they trade with other countries. If the US says such and such country is a bad behavior, take it to the UN. Go to the UN Security Council. See how far you get. If you win the unanimous vote, you can put on sanctions, because UN sanctions are perfectly allowable. The Security Council has that power. But you don't have the power to do it just by yourself.
So you're optimistic that the BRICS will come up with a resolution to this?
They will. Yeah, because this is not an enormously complicated technical problem. This is not some magic technology that only the US has, so there's no way to trade other than through SWIFT. The SWIFT system actually is a little bit antiquated. In the digital age, the way that SWIFT makes clearances is basically probably out of date 10 or 20 years, perhaps. And so there are all sorts of technical solutions that the BRICS can do. And my view is they'll do them because they need to do them. They don't want to live in a system where the US is able to crush their economy at will. And, a case of this, it didn't work with Russia because Russia has a highly fungible set of exports, mainly oil, that it could continue to trade, and a lot of the world wants their oil. And so the sanctions didn't work to crush the economy. But when the same sanctions were put on, similar comprehensive sanctions were put on Venezuela to try to topple the government of Nicolas Maduro back in 2017, especially 2018, it did crush the Venezuelan economy, not because they couldn't ship oil, by the way, but because they couldn't get spare parts to keep the oil production going. And so Venezuela's oil production collapsed with the US sanctions, and the Venezuelan economy suffered a catastrophic decline. Interestingly, by the way, it didn't lead to the toppling of the government because the sanctions don't have that political effect that the US dreams they do. They just have a nasty effect of impoverishing people, of making children die because they can't get health care, because the hospitals can't stock basic antibiotics and basic materials. So they create a lot of suffering. They don't achieve America's political goals. So they're weapons that go wildly off their aim trajectory, but they do a huge amount of damage. They are plainly illegal, but a country like Venezuela couldn't get around them. Russia was able to get around them.
Right, right. All right, I'm going to give a philosophic issue. In July, you published a proposal for 10 principles for perpetual peace in the 21st century. This began with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which had been proposed by China and adopted by the Asian-African Conference in Bandung in 1955. You proposed 5 additional principles, which called for, among other things, eliminating overseas military bases, an end to these regime change wars that we've discussed, a nuclear restraint and general disarmament, and restraint on security policies, and reform of the UN. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, I think I sent these to you, also issued what she called 10 Principles of a New International Security and Development Architecture. And while she would generally agree with the importance of your proposed principles, she believed that underlying the global crisis we face today is the moral and cultural decline in the majority of the populations of the Western world, which you sort of hinted at yourself.
Yeah.
She thus addressed the economic development of all nations, including the education and healthcare for all people. But more importantly, she added a philosophic point, several actually, but especially the 10th principle, which I'll read because it's well stated. Quote, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable of infinitely perfecting the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. So that's her 10th principle. This is something that people can accept only with deep reflection. It's not obvious. But she said it is, in fact, a common thread, at least in all the world's great religions, and is necessary if populations can be raised to a higher level of human creativity needed if there's going to be truly a global solution. So what are your reflections on this?
Well, I like it a lot, and it's almost a quote of Mencius, who was the leading disciple of Confucius, although 2 generations away, but the great, brilliant thinker who followed Confucius, and he said human nature is good. That was his argument. But he made a point, and I think it's very similar to what we just heard. He said human nature is good, but it doesn't mean all people are good. The goodness has to be cultivated. And he said people are like sprouts. The seed has the potential to become the healthy plant, but it has to be nurtured in order to develop the right way. So human beings are good doesn't mean they're automatically good or that all humans are good, but that they have the potential for good. Aristotle had a similar point. Aristotle also said that human beings have the potential to be, and actually have the human nature that aims for good. And his idea was we have to use our heads. We have to be rational, learn to think rationally, and train ourselves not to be carried away by hostile emotions or by impulses or by instinct, but learn to think. And he called that practical wisdom. And there's ancient Greek term for it called phronesis, which is the ability to use reason to choose well, to make peace, to behave as good citizens, to be friends. And just like Confucius and Mencius, Aristotle said we have the potential, but it's not guaranteed. There obviously are a lot of bad people, but we should cultivate the good. And so the idea of an ethics is, and I think it's exactly the statement you read, it's not to say the world is perfect and wonderful and human beings are good. It's to say we can develop the good side of our human nature. We have bad tendencies. We have tendencies to cheat, to lie, to follow impulses, to become addicted to power or to other things. But we can cultivate the good side with practice, with mentorship, with reading good books like the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle or the Analects by Confucius, and reflecting on what they teach. We can become good people. And that was, of course, Confucius's life mission, going around he went kingdom to kingdom. It did not work very well in his lifetime, trying to convince the rulers to be good people and to rule by virtue rather than to rule by force or by greed. But he had the long-term success that even hundreds of years after his death, a new emperor in the Han Dynasty arose and said, that's the philosophy I want to follow. And he got the Confucian learned scholars to come to his court and built a Confucian philosophy of governance in China. This was already 2,000 years ago, and it lasted basically until today. And so in this sense, this idea that we need an ethics of the good to underpin what we're doing, I think is very correct, very real. I was trying to make a list of how do we end these useless wars by the direct action. Stop. The U.S. has 750 overseas military bases. Are you kidding? That's already a kind of craziness. How can a country have 750 overseas military bases? Who do they think they are? What are we doing? Why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on this? And so I say, stop that. Stop all of this CIA-led regime change operation business, which has gone on for decades, where you have these secret operations to overthrow governments. This doesn't work. It destabilizes countries. It makes wars and danger. Recognize, and then very importantly, the U.S. walked out of several nuclear arms control agreements. We basically barely have a nuclear arms control framework at this point, and all indications are we're heading closer and closer to nuclear war. And so I think that this also deserves urgent attention. Right. And then I point out at the end on my list that we actually have a lot of things we need to do together that we're not doing. If we want to have prosperity, if we want to have safety, we have to cooperate. And so we should also be directing attention to win-win ideas. Now, by the way, China has put forward these 5 principles, and I add these 5 of my own. But China's 5 principles are really attractive. They start with mutual respect. They start with or they call for non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. That's also a basic standard of international law. They call for win-win cooperation. In other words, they're smart Confucian ideas of how to get along. And I'm hoping actually practically that given all of this war, these disasters, I want the countries in the UN actually to vote a list like this in the not too distant future. In other words, to reflect not just as an op-ed piece or a thought piece, but actually to put a set of principles together that at least can show the world This is a standard of good behavior of statecraft. This is how we think countries should act so that we don't blow ourselves to pieces. I think it will make a difference because even though not everyone behaves according to principles that are set, it helps people to understand what's possible. And this, I hope, the General Assembly will do in a very practical way. At least I'm trying to push the point, suggest the point to the governments right now.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have a special event on October 26th in Manhattan. If you're going to be back in New York, I encourage you to attend. We're getting a large hall. We're going to try to do sort of a shock effect conference with 1,000 or more people. It's going to be leading speakers of the sort that we've been having on our International Peace Coalition weekly meetings. But we're also going to have a classical music concert, classical music, including spirituals, which
sounds
you
great.
know from the great musicians like Marian Anderson and others. The spirituals are more than folk songs or something. They are classical in nature. They come from the heart and the mind. And so we'll be doing a number of spirituals. We'll probably also be doing a great Russian composition by Bortniansky from the 18th century, and other things. But the idea here is to sort of insist that a higher level of culture, and especially classical music, is essential if people are going to change the way they think. And you said before, we have to make people think in a different way. And this is the intent of that event. I'll send you material as we have it on that. Are you going to be back in New York?
No, I'll still be in Europe
okay.
traveling, so I'll miss that. But it sounds like a glorious occasion.
Yeah.
I watched, by the way, in 2017, 2018, when the G20 was hosted by Germany in Hamburg. Angela Merkel called for a concert for the leaders, and I happened to be sitting in the audience in a balcony just over the world leaders of the G20. And of course, the last piece on the score that evening, in the program that evening, was Beethoven's Ninth Ode to Joy, and you should have seen the faces of the world leaders, because even the most hardened, everyone just lit up because it's a universal language. If we could get a little Beethoven into this, a little bit of Ode to Joy and All Men Are Brothers, Ali mentioned, it does work. It touches the heart. So it's absolutely a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. Which was Beethoven's intention.
Exactly. It worked.
That's why we call ourselves the Schiller Institute, which is
exactly. And the great Schiller Ode. So it really works.
Unfortunately, that's not what our colleges are teaching their children these days. You're still a professor at Columbia, I believe, right?
I am. Exactly.
As you know, there were major peace demonstrations at Columbia in the spring, and many other campuses. The situation has gotten far worse since that time, and yet there appears to be very little protest at the universities, even though they've opened up and so forth. Representative Steve Scalise, I'm sure you know who that is, said just a couple days ago, he said that Congress is acting to stop the anti-Israel protests on the campuses, telling them, quote, "Your accreditation is on the line. You're not playing games anymore, or else you're not a school anymore." And he added, quote, "We're bringing legislation to the floor to continue to confront it, to stand up against it, to show we support Israel." Is this suppression working, or are there other causes that there has not been a resurgence on the campuses this fall?
Well, look, basically, the students who were calling for justice for the Palestinians had the police called on them. That's it. Yeah. So they were arrested, and that happened last spring. that shuts down a lot of activity. The university took an extremely hard line. It forgot that it's a university. It forgot that it is a community of students and professors who are also not only an educational community but a moral community. It forgot all of that because the police were basically called from the start. It was dreadful, and of course, administrators across the country are bullied and cowed by what Congress is doing. Not just Congress, by their own boards, their own donors, and so on. So the situation is that I'm very proud of our students. I'm very proud when they demonstrate. I think that universities also should respond to this by all sorts of lectures and workshops and discussions and debates and learning about the history and using the intellectual qualities of the university to help educate. And very little of that has happened. And it's really a disappointment.
Indeed. Well, okay. I appreciate this very much. I think will have a very big effect around the world.
Good to speak with you about all these issues. It's a really troubling and very dangerous time.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to go to our readers and supporters?
Well, I think everyone needs to tell your respective governments everywhere, make peace. These are wars. Like, by the way, the war theorist von Clausewitz said when he wrote his magnum opus on war in the 1830s, war is the continuation of politics by other means or with other means. And so when you see war, think politics. When you look at the war in the Middle East, the politics there are that Israel has blocked a state of Palestine, and that's the way to peace. When you think about the war in Ukraine, the politics is that the United States insisted that Ukraine be in the U.S. military alliance rather than a neutral country, which would have kept Ukraine safe and which would make Ukraine safe when that proper position is taken. So all of these fights can be resolved through sensible politics, and yet we're in a warmongering era, and it's extremely important that our governments hear from us. They're not listening, they're not asking our opinions, but we should give them our opinions. We want peace, we want solutions to this, we want to avoid this very dire and very real nuclear threat above all. So I want to thank you, for what you're doing and for also the discussion we've just had. And people everywhere should be working for peace.